I was 31 years old on the night my life finally cracked open. Christmas Eve in Charleston had always looked beautiful from the outside. The wreath on the front door glowed with tiny gold lights. The good china came out of the cabinet, and the house smelled like roasted ham and nutmeg the way it had since I was a kid. You would think a room like that could hold a family together. You would think warmth and candles could drown out everything else. But standing there in my childhood kitchen, I felt like a guest who had shown up without an invitation. I could hear the laughter drifting from the dining room, bright and effortless, most of it coming from my sister Olivia. She was 34 then, and wearing a deep red dress that somehow matched both the table runner and the way my dad adored her. I paused at the doorway and watched her tilt her head while talking to him, the same way she used to do when she wanted something as a teenager. I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself. I had promised that this year would be different, that I would let things roll off my back, that I would not let old wounds open. But even before I sat down, something in my chest felt tight in a way that told me I had lied to myself. This is usually the moment in a story when someone tells you to imagine the scene, but I do not need you to imagine anything yet. I want you just to picture yourself with me for a second, because later, when everything fell apart, I remember wondering what other people were doing when they finally reached their breaking point. So I will ask you now, in the gentlest way, what are you doing while listening to this story? For me, when the moment hit, I was standing beside a doorway, holding a plate of rolls, trying to decide whether I belonged at that table at all. I carried the rolls in and slid into the only empty seat left at the end of the table near the hallway. It was not officially a place for leftovers, but it felt like one. Dad sat at the head, his shoulders squared, his sweater the color of winter fog. Mom sat to his right, quiet, moving food around her plate as if that could keep the peace the way it never really had. Dinner began with the usual chorus of praise. Olivia bought a house in Raleigh this year. Olivia traveled to Italy in the spring. Olivia organized some big campaigns at work. Every accomplishment landed like a stone on my chest. Not because she did not deserve good things, but because the room only ever lit up for her. I kept my smile soft and polite, the way you do when you have learned to make yourself small. Mom glanced at me once. Her smile flickered, thin and brittle. She passed me the carrots without a word. The table reflected everything I had tried to ignore since childhood. Dad asked Olivia about her plans for the new year. He asked her about investments and vacations and when she might be getting engaged. When his eyes drifted toward me, it was more out of habit than interest. He did not ask about my work, or the community jobs I had taken to make ends meet, or the way I had been trying to rebuild my life after a difficult year. Instead, he looked past me toward the window as if checking the weather. I pushed a piece of ham around my plate and tried to swallow the sting of it. I kept replaying an old memory, the kind that arrives when you least want it to. When I was 12, I sat at the kids' table in that very room and overheard an aunt whisper that someday Olivia would go far, while I would stay exactly where I was. I had never forgotten that, even though I pretended I did. Dad cleared his throat. Conversation died instantly. He picked up his wine glass and lifted it slightly. That was always his cue. A toast. A declaration. Something that would echo across the table and land exactly where he wanted it to land. He started by talking about gratitude, about the blessings of the year, about family. Everyone leaned in. Olivia tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and waited for her praise. Then his eyes slid toward me, just for a breath. Some people bring pride to this family, and some people only take up space. Silence. Then a burst of laughter from Olivia. Then cousins. Then the clink of forks, as if nothing had happened at all. The words hit harder than I expected, harder than I was prepared for. My ears rang. The room blurred at the edges. Mom stared at her plate. Her fingers tightened around her napkin. But she did not speak. My fork slipped from my hand. The small metallic sound seemed to slice through the room. I stood. Chair legs scraped the hardwood. The conversation barely paused. That was the part that hurt the most. The ease with which they continued. I walked out of the dining room, through the hallway, past the pine garland Mom had hung earlier that morning. The hallway felt colder than it should have. When I opened the front door, the cold Charleston air rushed across my face. It was the kind of chill that wakes you from whatever dream or delusion you have been living in. I walked to my car with my heart pounding in my throat. I did not grab a coat. I did not say goodbye. I did not look back. The porch lights glowed behind me, and the sound of laughter spilled into the yard as if I were leaving a party I had never truly been part of. I got in my car. My hands shook as I turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. I pulled out of the driveway, the tires crushing gravel in a slow, steady rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. My phone lit up on the passenger seat. First one call, then another, then several more. Mom, Dad, Olivia, unknown numbers. I watched the screen flash until it felt like a warning light. I turned the phone face down and kept driving. North, toward a highway I remembered from years of imagining escape. The farther I went, the lighter my chest felt. Not happy, not relieved, but something close to breathing again. By the time I crossed the first long bridge out of Charleston, the laughter from that dining room was already fading behind me and 35 missed calls in my phone. I only knew one thing for certain. If I turned back even for a moment, I would lose myself in ways I might never recover from. So I kept driving into the dark, not knowing where the road would take me, only knowing it had to be somewhere far from the table where I had never truly belonged. So I kept driving into the dark, not knowing where the road would take me, only knowing it had to be somewhere far from the table where I had never truly belonged. The highway opened wide ahead of me, the lanes empty except for a few long-haul trucks that thundered past and shook my little car. The farther I moved from Charleston, the thinner the air felt inside my chest, like I had been holding my breath for years without realizing it. I cracked the window even though the winter wind cut straight through me. I needed the cold. I needed something real against my skin. I made it through South Carolina before the sky even began to lighten. Somewhere near the North Carolina border, my phone, still face down on the seat, buzzed with another wave of missed calls. I ignored it. I kept my eyes on the white dashed lines rushing under me. I knew if I let myself think too hard, I might pull over and lose my nerve. By the time I reached Fayetteville, the ache in my back was sharp enough that I had to stop. I pulled into a gas station off the interstate. The kind where the fluorescent lights flicker and the smell of burnt coffee drifts through the cold air. I filled up the tank with numb fingers and went inside to buy a bottle of water. The cashier barely looked at me. I was grateful for that. When I came back out, a man in a heavy jacket walked past my car and muttered something under his breath. I caught only part of it. Something about holiday drivers. Something about people who should stay home. I stood still for a moment, the old instinct rising up, the one that made me want to apologize, even when I had done nothing wrong. I closed the door firmly before the apology could escape. I drove for hours through North Carolina, the interstate stretching ahead in long gray stripes. Hills rose and fell around me, and sometimes, when the road curved just right, the sun hit the windshield and I squinted so hard my eyes watered. I passed towns I had only seen on maps: Lumberton, Dunn, Smithfield, names that felt like stepping stones toward a life I had not yet imagined. Late in the afternoon, the sky turned a muted gold and the temperature dropped. Lower, I rolled my shoulders back, trying to ignore the ache that settled into my spine. Around Raleigh, I finally turned the phone on. It lit up at once with 35 missed calls and a string of texts. The names glowed like warnings. Mom, Dad, Olivia. Unknown numbers. One message from a cousin asking where I had gone. Another from a neighbor who had clearly heard something already. I scrolled through them, numb. Olivia's message sat at the bottom. It read a single sentence. You always have to make everything about you. I stared at it for a moment, feeling nothing and everything at the same time. Then I turned the phone off again. It felt like the only boundary I had left. Traffic slowed near Richmond. I spent nearly an hour behind a semi-truck whose back doors were rusted and covered in stickers from places I had never been. By the time I reached the outskirts of the city, exhaustion pulled at every part of me. I needed to stop for the night. I found a cheap motel off the highway. One of those places with an ice machine that never works and a front desk. Clerk, who barely glances up when you sign the paperwork. The room smelled faintly of cleaning spray and old cigarettes. I locked the door twice, dropped my bag on the floor, and collapsed onto the bed. My legs felt strange, almost hollow from the hours of gripping the pedals. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of someone's television through the wall. A couple argued in the parking lot. Car doors slammed. Somewhere far down the hall, a baby cried. And even with all that noise, the quiet inside me felt louder. I tried to sleep, but the moment at the dinner table kept looping through my mind. The lifted glass. The laughter. My mom's eyes flicked down. Olivia's bright, loud smile. My own breath catching. I pressed the heel of my hand against my forehead as if I could push the memory out through my skin. At some point after midnight, I sat up and turned on the little desk lamp. I pulled out my wallet. Inside it was a scrap of paper I had kept since college. Maggie Turner's handwriting, scribbled over the margin of an old syllabus. It had a doodle of a tiny cabin and the words, "Someday we should build something together." Back when we were 20, it was a joke, a dream for another life. I stared at it until the edges blurred. Maggie had moved up to a small town in New York a few years ago. She taught art at an elementary school and volunteered at the church craft. We had not spoken in months, but she had always been one of the few people who saw me, really saw me. I pulled out my phone and held it in my hand. I have not turned it on yet. I just held it there, feeling the weight of it, feeling the possibility of it. A thought about Charleston fading behind me and the long stretch of highway. Ahead, I thought about the dining room with its perfect wreath and its perfect daughter and its perfect silence. Around 2 a.m, the world outside the motel window had grown still. Snow began to fall in thin white sheets, blowing sideways in the headlights of passing cars. I stood up and pressed my hand against the cold glass, watching it gather in small drifts. I knew I could not go back. I knew I had to keep moving north, and I knew, without understanding why, that I needed to call Maggie. I sat back down on the bed, took a breath that trembled on the way in, and finally powered on my phone. The screen lit the whole room in a pale blue glow. I ignored the notifications that appeared like a flood and scrolled straight to her number. I did not call, not yet. I just stared at it. The snow falling harder outside, the road waiting for me at dawn. And then the phone vibrated again in my hand. One last call coming through before the screen dimmed. I did not answer. I lay back down instead, staring at the ceiling until the dark shifted into early morning. That was when I finally knew that I would drive to New York and knock on Maggie's door whether she expected me or not. I closed my eyes and waited for the sun. When the sun finally broke through the thin motel curtains, I felt like I had not slept at all. The air in the room was cold enough that I could see a faint cloud each time I exhaled. I sat up slowly, rubbing the stiffness out of my neck. Outside, a thin layer of snow covered the hoods of the cars parked crookedly across the lot, and the sky looked like it had been washed in pale gray watercolor. I showered, dressed, repacked my bag, and checked out of the motel without speaking more than a few words to the woman behind the front desk. She eyed me with the tired indifference of someone who had seen 100 travelers pass through before sunrise. I stepped out into the parking lot, pulled my jacket tighter, and climbed into the car. When the engine started with a low groan, I rested my forehead against the cold steering wheel for a moment before forcing myself upright. I drove north. The roads were clearer than I expected, just wet in long, shimmering streaks. The winter sun kept sliding behind heavy clouds, offering light but no warmth. After an hour, the motion of the car began to settle something inside me. My thoughts moved like slow traffic, one idea pulling up behind another. By the time I reached the northern edge of Virginia, I knew I could not avoid calling Maggie any longer. I pulled into a rest area off the highway, parked under a leafless tree, and let the heater run for a minute. My hands shook when I took the phone from the cup holder. I did not let myself think. I just dialed. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was warm, still a little gravelly in the morning, the way it had always been when we used to stay up too late studying in the student lounge. "Nora." Her voice caught me off guard. "Are you okay?" I closed my eyes and let my head fall back against the seat. "I'm not sure," I said. "I'm driving north. I'm heading toward you." There was a quiet pause on the line. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. "Did something happen?" I let out a long breath. Christmas dinner happened. My dad, my sister, the whole thing. And I walked out. Then I kept driving until I reached a motel in Richmond. "I'm halfway to your town now, Nora," she said softly. And there was no judgment in her tone, only a kind of steady concern. "Come, just come. My guest room is empty, and the heat works better than it did last winter." She gave a short laugh. "They fixed it after the pipe burst. You will be fine here. I will make coffee." I felt something in my chest loosen. "I will be there tonight," I said, and she told me which exit to take once I crossed into New York. When she hung up, I sat there for a moment staring at the quiet road in front of me. It was the first time in years that someone had told me to come without asking, for an explanation, or reminding me of all the reasons I should not. The drive through Maryland and Delaware blurred together in long stretches of bare trees and frozen fields. I stopped twice for coffee that tasted like burnt plastic, but the heat kept my hands warm. Near Wilmington, traffic thickened. I merged and unmerged and crept forward foot by foot until I reached the state line, into New Jersey. The air somehow felt colder there, sharper, as if it had a point of view about me. Somewhere near Trenton, the phone buzzed again. I checked it at a red light. Another string of messages from Olivia. "Where are you? Do you realize how childish this looks? Mom is upset. Dad is furious. You made a scene in front of the whole family. You should apologize before this gets worse." I deleted the notifications without opening them fully. The light turned green, and I eased back onto the road. Let her fill the air with noise. I was too tired to carry their expectations anymore. By late afternoon, the sky grew darker and the wind picked up. The closer I got to New York, the more the landscape changed. Towns dotted the highway with clusters of small houses, gas stations, diners, Christmas lights still half hanging from porches. When I crossed into the outskirts of Orange County, the snow started again, drifting across the windshield like small scraps of paper. I took the exit Maggie had given me. The roads there were smaller, lined with pine trees and old stone walls buried under powdery snow. My headlights illuminated long, sloping hills and fenced fields that looked forgotten in winter. I followed her directions until I saw the wooden sign that marked her street, Turner Road. The coincidence never failed to make me smile. Her house came into view a few minutes later, a small two-story cottage with white trim and soft golden light glowing from the windows. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney. It looked like something from a postcard, too perfect in a way that made my throat tighten. I pulled into her driveway and cut the engine. For a moment I stayed in the car, hands still gripping the wheel, watching my breath fog the glass. Then the front door opened, and Maggie stepped out into the cold. She wore a thick burgundy sweater, jeans, and boots dusted in snow. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and she looked exactly the same and completely different at the same time. She walked toward the car with quick steps, her breath hanging in the air. When I opened the door, she wrapped her arms around me before I could speak. The warmth of her hug hit me like a shock. I pressed my forehead against her shoulder, breathing in the faint scent of cedar and detergent. "You are safe now," she said quietly. "You are here. Come inside." She led me into the house. The warmth wrapped around me immediately, thick and comforting. In the kitchen, a kettle was steaming on the stove. A plate of oatmeal cookies sat on the counter, probably something she had baked earlier without knowing she would be offering them to me. "Sit," she said, pulling out a chair for me at the small kitchen table. I sat, my legs shaking from the long day of driving. She poured 2 mugs of hot coffee and slid one toward me. Then she sat across from me, her eyes steady on mine. "Start wherever you can," she said. I took a sip, feeling the heat spread down my throat. The words sat heavy in my chest, but they finally moved. I told her about the Christmas table, the roast, the wreath. The way Olivia's laugh filled every corner while my mom pretended everything was fine. I told her about my dad lifting his glass, looking at me like I had inconvenienced him just by existing. I told her his words, wasted space, and how the room tilted when everyone laughed. Maggie didn't interrupt. She didn't soften it or ask me to rethink it. She just listened, her face tightening with quiet anger that wasn't aimed at me. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Nora," she said, her voice low with conviction, "you deserved better than that long before Christmas." I swallowed hard. I know. I just could not breathe in that house anymore. I had to get out before something inside me snapped. She squeezed my hand. "Then you came to the right place. You can stay as long as you need. We will take it one day at a time." Her words settled over me like a blanket. I looked around the little kitchen, at the glow from the stove light, at the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. It was the first place that had felt like a landing spot in longer than I could remember. Outside, the snow thickened, brushing against the windows like tiny whispers. Maggie stood and grabbed a spare blanket from the hallway, draping it over my shoulders. "Eat something," she said gently. "Then rest. We will talk more in the morning. There is no rush." I nodded, the exhaustion finally catching up with me in full weight. My hands wrapped around the mug again, letting the warmth seep into my palms. I looked at her, standing there in the soft kitchen light with concern etched across her face, and something inside me shifted in a way I could not name yet. The world felt quieter here, but in the quiet was something unfamiliar, something I had not had in years. Possibility. I took a bite of the cookie. The room blurred slightly at the edges, the warmth and fatigue blending together. And for the first time since I left Charleston, I felt myself breathe all the way in. I woke to the faint creaking of old floorboards and the low hum of Maggie's heater struggling against the morning cold. For a moment, I did not remember where I was. The ceiling above me was slanted, painted a soft cream color, not the pale blue of my childhood bedroom, or the off-white of the motel. Then the smell of coffee drifted up the stairs and everything came back to me, in slow, steady pieces. I slipped out of bed and wrapped one of Maggie's oversized cardigans around myself. When I walked downstairs, she was standing at the stove, stirring something in a small pot. She glanced over her shoulder when she heard me. "Morning," she said, her voice warm in a way that made something inside me loosen. "Are you hungry?" "A little," I said, though my appetite was still uncertain. Maggie slid a bowl toward me, oatmeal with cinnamon and apples. Simple, but comforting. I ate quietly while she made her own coffee. After a while, she sat across from me again, exactly like the night before, but the sunlight made everything feel different. Softer, less heavy. She watched me take another bite, then folded her hands on the table. "What is your plan today, Nora?" I stared at the oatmeal, stirring it once with my spoon. "I do not know yet." My voice felt small. "I should probably check my email. Maybe look for freelance gigs. I could help around here or pick up something part-time. I guess I need to figure out a few things." She nodded, not pushing. "Take one step first. Just one. The rest will show up when you need it." It sounded like something she said to her elementary students, but somehow it steadied me. After breakfast, she offered me a coat and boots because mine were too thin for New York winter. I insisted I could manage, but she just shook her head and pushed them toward me anyway. We stepped outside into the crisp air. Her yard stretched toward a line of tall pines, the snow still untouched except for the small path leading to her shed. The world felt still, holding its breath. Maggie rubbed her hands together. "I forgot to tell you," she said. "I called my friend earlier, the one who runs the little furniture studio near the library. She is looking for someone who can help on weekdays. Sanding, cutting, basic assembly. It is not full-time, but she pays fairly. I told her you might be a good fit." I blinked at her. "Maggie, you did not have to do that." She shrugged lightly. "I know how your mind works. If you are idle too long, you will start believing whatever your dad said at that dinner. And I am not letting that happen." Her words stung in the kindest way. The idea of working with wood surprised me. I had always liked fixing things, assembling small pieces, but it had never been anything more than a quiet escape. The thought of walking into a workshop, of hearing tools and seeing raw material turn into something real, made something flicker in my chest. We walked toward the shed behind her house. She opened the door and flipped on the light. Inside were shelves full of paints, brushes, small tools, boxes labeled in her tidy handwriting. The space smelled like pine and old paper. One corner held a small workbench with clamps and a stack of unfinished wooden frames. "You can use this space whenever you want," she said. "Warm up here before you visit the studio. Just see how it feels. No pressure." I touched the edge of the workbench. The surface was smooth and worn from years of use. I felt the texture of it under my fingertips, a quiet grain that somehow grounded me. A gust of cold air rushed in when the wind shifted outside. Maggie pulled her sweater tighter and stepped back. "I will be in the kitchen if you need anything. Take your time." When she left, I stood there alone in the shed for several minutes, hands resting on the wooden surface. The silence felt different from the silence I had grown up with. This one held room for me. I looked around at the tools hanging neatly on hooks, the stacks of wood waiting to become something. I picked up a small hand sander and turned it over in my hands. The vibration of the dinner table came back to me, the laugh that ran down its length like a blade. I closed my eyes and steadied myself. "Not here," I whispered inside my own mind. "Not in this place." I set the sander down and sorted through a small pile of scrap pieces. Some had beautiful knots. Some had uneven edges. They reminded me of people who survived things they never should have. I picked one up and traced a finger along its grain. I heard the crunch of tires outside. I startled slightly and stepped out of the shed. A white SUV was pulling into Maggie's driveway. At first I thought it might be a delivery truck, but when the door opened and I saw the familiar posture of the woman stepping out, my stomach dropped. Mom. She looked smaller somehow, wrapped in her long winter coat. The scarf pulled up around her neck. Her hair was pinned neatly, but pieces of it had loosened from the cold wind. When she turned and saw me standing near the shed, her breath visibly caught. She lifted a hand in an unsure wave. "Nora," her voice trembled, and I could not tell whether it was from the cold or from everything she had not said since Christmas night. I took a few steps toward her, stopping several feet away. Snow flurries drifted between us like tiny drifting reminders of the distance we had made. "What are you doing here?" I asked. My voice steady but cautious. She swallowed hard. "I needed to see you. You left so quickly. Your dad is upset, but that is not why I came. I need to understand what happened." I looked at her face, at the worry lines that had deepened over the years, at the eyes that had always darted toward my dad before she spoke her own mind. I felt that familiar tangle of wanting to protect her and wanting to pull away from her, completely. Maggie opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. She did not say anything, but the instant she saw who was standing in the driveway, her posture changed, protective, watchful. Mom glanced at her and looked briefly embarrassed. "Can we talk?" she asked me softly. I nodded and walked past her toward the house. Mom hesitated for a moment before following me inside. Maggie stepped back to let us enter, her eyes scanning my expression. We sat in the living room, the coffee table between us. Mom looked around the space like she was afraid to touch anything. "You look tired," she said cautiously. I nodded. "I could say the same for you." She folded her hands in her lap, struggling to find the right words. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked slightly. "Your sister is telling everyone that you overreacted. She said you embarrassed the family." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Of course she did. Mom's shoulders slumped. "Nora, I know your dad's words hurt you, I know. But sometimes things come out wrong in moments like that. He did not mean to call you that." I stared at her. "Yes, he did," I said quietly. "He meant it down to the bone. And you know he did." Mom flinched. The truth hung heavy between us. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the house, and something inside me began to settle. We sat in silence for a moment before she finally looked up at me again. "I just want to understand you," she whispered. "I want to understand what made you walk out." I watched her face. For once, she was not hiding her fear behind careful politeness. She was simply a woman who had lost her footing inside the family she helped build and was reaching out, even shakily, to her daughter. I took a slow breath. I left because I did not want to disappear anymore. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, they were wet. "I did not notice," she whispered. "I did not see how small you had gotten over the years." Her voice broke, but she kept talking. and I could feel the conversation bending towards something real for the first time. In a long time. That was when Maggie stepped into the doorway, watching us both carefully. She did not interrupt. She just waited, knowing there was more to come. And there was, so much more, waiting just under the surface of the quiet room. But for a moment, none of us moved. Mom stared down at her hands like the answers might be written in the faint blue veins on the backs of them. Maggie stayed very still in the doorway, giving me room, but her presence felt like a steady hand on my back. Mom finally drew in a breath and said that she had spent years telling herself that if she just kept the peace, everyone would be fine. She admitted in a low voice that she had focused on my dad's temper and Olivia's needs, and that somewhere along the way she had lost track of me. She said she did not realize how invisible I had become until she watched me walk out the door on Christmas and saw nobody go after me. The words landed deep. Not quite an apology, not quite enough, but closer than anything she had ever given me. I told her that I felt like furniture in that house. Useful, sometimes necessary, but never the reason anyone gathered. I told her that when Dad called me wasted space and everyone laughed, it was like someone finally said out loud what they had all been acting out for years. She flinched at that. Then she said quietly that my dad was furious, that he was embarrassed, and complaining that I had humiliated him in front of his own family. He felt, she said, that I had walked out deliberately to make him look bad. She added that Olivia agreed and was telling anyone who would listen that I always had to create drama. My stomach clenched, but it was not a surprise. It was recognition. I asked Mom if she believed that. For a long moment, she did not answer. Then she shook her head very slightly, like it cost her something to admit. No one spoke for a while. I watched her fight with herself, the part of her that had been trained to protect my dad's image, and the part that had just driven hundreds of miles alone to see me. Finally, she looked up, eyes red, and asked what I needed from her. The question stunned me. No one in my family had asked me that directly in years. The answer did not come out pretty, but it came out true. I told her I needed distance. I needed her to stop asking me to apologize just to make holidays easier for everyone else. I said that if she wanted a relationship with me, it had to be separate from Dad's demands and Olivia's delicate feelings. Mom pressed her fingers to her lips, absorbing that. She said that was going to be hard. I said I knew. I also said that I was done sitting at the edge of their table, begging for a place. If they could not make room for me, then I would build a life where I did not have to ask. When I said that, something in my own words surprised me. Build a life. It sat in my chest like a small, warm stone. Mom watched my face change and asked softly what that meant. I told her I did not know yet, but that I was starting with one decision. I was staying here for a while, in this town, in this house, far away from Charleston. I would not be coming home just to smooth things over, not this time. She let out a shaky breath and nodded, as if she had expected that answer and dreaded it at the same time. She asked if she could call me, just me, without my dad on speaker, if she could try to get to know the version of her daughter who was not, shrinking herself to fit the family script. I said that we could try, but that I would hang up if she turned every conversation into a report about him. Maggie stepped forward then, offering my mom a glass of water, like a small truce. She spoke gently, saying that I was safe here and that I was trying to figure out what came next. She told my mom that pushing me back toward Charleston would only break whatever fragile thread we were spinning between us right now. Mom took the water with both hands and thanked her. She looked around the living room and said she could see why I felt like I could breathe here. After a few more minutes, she stood, saying she had to drive back before the roads iced over. At the door, she hesitated, then reached out and hugged me. It was tentative, not the fierce embrace I secretly wanted, but it was more than the quick holiday squeezes I was used to. Into my shoulder, she murmured that she was sorry she had not seen things sooner. She said she would try to do better, though she did not know yet what that would look like. I told her that trying was more than anyone had done for me in a long time. I watched her drive away, the white SUV disappearing down the narrow road lined with bare trees. My chest ached with a strange mix of grief and hope, like standing on a dock watching a boat leave, not knowing if it would ever return the same way. Inside, Maggie handed me a mug of tea and we sat at the kitchen table. She let me talk in messy circles, about Mom, about the years of being the quiet one. about the way that one sentence at dinner had torn open every old wound. She listened, and occasionally shook her head, muttering that some parents had a real talent for missing the child who needed them most. After a while, she changed the subject gently. She reminded me about the furniture studio near the library. Her friend Ruth had said I could stop by that afternoon, just to see the place. No pressure, no commitment. Maggie suggested that putting my hands on something solid might help pull me out of the emotional fog. So, later that day, bundled up in her borrowed coat and boots, I walked the few blocks to Maple Street where the studio was, tucked between a bakery and a thrift store. The sign above the door read Maple Hill Woodworks in chipped green lettering. Through the front window, I could see tables, shelves, and picture frames stacked against exposed brick walls. It looked both cluttered and intentional, like everything in there was in the process of becoming. Inside, the air smelled like sawdust and varnish. A woman in her early 60s with short gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses looked up. She wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled and strong hands that told me she had been doing this for a long time. She introduced herself as Ruth and said Maggie had told her I might stop by. She asked if I had ever worked with wood before. I told her honestly that I had only done small projects, fixing things for myself when they broke, assembling furniture from kits without instructions. Her eyes lit with mild interest at that last part. She showed there were half-finished coffee tables, a long farmhouse table clamped and drying, stacks of boards leaning against the back wall. She pointed out the tools as we walked, naming them almost affectionately. I ran my hand along one of the tabletops and felt the smoothness under my fingers, the subtle warmth of the grain. Ruth asked if I wanted to try sanding a small piece, just to get a feel for it. She guided my hands on the sander at first, then stepped back. The buzz of the tool vibrated up my arms. It should have been tiring, but it felt strangely calming, like the noise in my head was finally being drowned out by something that did not hurt. While I worked, she talked about how people treated tables, how some families use them as altars for celebration, and how some use them as stages for power games. She laughed softly and said you could tell a lot about a person by which chair they chose at Sunday dinner. I thought of my dad's permanent spot at the head and my own drifting place at the edge. I pressed the sander a little harder without meaning to. Ruth noticed the tension in my shoulders and gently told me to let the tool do the work, not my anger. Her words were kind, not sharp. She said anger could be useful as fuel, but it would tire my body out if I let it drive my hands all the time. Better to channel it into design, into choices about what to build and how. When I set the sander down, the small piece of wood looked different, cleaned up, ready to be part of something. Ruth examined it, nodded, and said I had a good touch. She offered me a part-time position on the spot, a few days a week, learning as I went. The pay would not be high, but it would be steady and honest. Walking back to Maggie's house through the early evening light, I felt an unfamiliar sense of possibility again. I had a place to go, a place where my work would leave marks you could actually see. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I turned the corner. I did not take it out. That night, lying in the small guest room under a heavy quilt, I stared at the sloped ceiling and thought about tables, the one in Charleston, where every joke cut like a knife, the ones in Ruth's studio, waiting to be finished and moved into homes I would never visit. I thought about what it would feel like to make one that did not have a head at all, just a circle where every person could see every other person's face. The idea settled into me slowly, like the way snow fills in footprints until they disappear. I did not know it yet, but that thought was the first quiet spark of the life I would build next. I turned onto my side, listening to the faint hum of the heater and the distant sound of the wind, and finally drifted into the first real sleep I had had since I walked away from my family's Christmas table. The next morning, I woke before the sun, the room still dim and cold, the quilt pulled up to my chin. For a few seconds, I lay there listening to the quiet hum of the heater and the faint rustle of Maggie moving around downstairs. My body felt heavier than usual, but in a steady, grounded way, like I had finally landed somewhere after drifting too long. I dressed slowly, layering clothes against the sharp New York winter. When I came down the stairs, Maggie was scribbling something on a notepad at the kitchen counter. She looked up and smiled the second she saw me. "Ruth called earlier," she said. She wants you to come in whenever you are ready." She said there was no rush, but she sounded excited. I poured myself coffee, the steam warming my face. I could not help the small flutter that moved through me, nervousness mixed with something close to anticipation. I reminded myself it was just a part-time job in a small-town workshop, nothing dramatic, nothing permanent. But for me, it was still a beginning. After breakfast, I bundled up again, slipped on the boots Maggie had insisted I borrow, and walked toward Maple Street. The snow along the sidewalks was packed down, but not icy, and the cold air stung my cheeks in a bracing, almost comforting way. The town was quiet at that hour. Smoke curled from chimneys. A dog barked once in the distance. Lights flicked on in the bakery windows. Inside the woodshop, the warmth and smell of sawdust wrapped around me, immediately. Ruth was at the back adjusting a clamp on a table leg. She looked up, pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose, and gave me a small, approving nod. "Good, you came," she said. "Grab an apron. We have a few things to get started today." I slipped on an old canvas apron that was stiff with years of use. She handed me a fresh pair of protective glasses. The shop lights cast a soft glow that made every grain of wood look warmer. Ruth walked me through the tasks she needed help with, sanding and smoothing out a set of small side tables, so taking a shipment of reclaimed wood pieces, cleaning up the back corner where the scraps had piled too high. Nothing complicated, nothing a person could ruin by accident, but it was purposeful. It pulled my mind toward the present moment, toward the feel of the work in my hands. I took up the sander again, the vibration running up my arms in a steady rhythm. As I worked, Ruth told me stories from her own life, how she had spent 30 years in a corporate job before quitting to build furniture full-time, how she had no children and no regrets about that, how she believed the things people made with their hands revealed the parts of them they tried to hide. While she talked, I began to feel the edges of my old life slipping away a little, not disappearing, just loosening their grip. Around midday, she suggested we take a break. We walked to the bakery next door, where the smell of fresh bread practically melted into the cold air outside the door. We each ordered a sandwich and sat by the window where sunlight bounced off, the thin sheet of snow covering the street. She watched me for a moment as I ate, then asked carefully if I wanted to talk about what had brought me to this town. I surprised myself by telling her more than I intended to. I told her about my dad's toast at Christmas, the laughter, the 35 missed calls, the years that came before it, years of being the placeholder child beside the golden one. Ruth listened with a quiet that did not press. She said that people like my dad used tables as stages and throne rooms. They learned early that whoever sat at the head got to decide who mattered. She said that leaving that system was not running away. It was choosing a new one. Her words lingered with me the rest of the afternoon. When we returned to the shop, she showed me how to use a small router to round the edges of a shelf piece. I practiced slowly, adjusting my grip as the tool moved through the wood in clean, smooth arcs. She watched closely, nodding when I steadied the pace. "You have good instincts," she said. "Most people fight the tools. You work with them." A quiet warmth spread across my chest. It had been a long time since anyone had complimented me for the way I existed, rather than the way I stayed out of the way. Later in the afternoon, she gave me a different project, sorting through a pile of old wooden boards that had been donated from a barn, being torn down. The boards were weathered, uneven, some cracked at the ends. But when I lifted one and tilted it in the light, the grain shimmered beneath the scars. "These have good bones," Ruth said. "They have history. The trick is knowing which pieces can be reborn." I ran my hand along the rough surface. The idea echoed inside me, almost painfully. I knew she saw the way I paused because she rested her hand briefly on my shoulder before stepping back. She did not say anything else, but she did not have to. In the late afternoon, Maggie stopped by the shop, cheeks flushed from the cold, and a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. She said she had just finished school and wanted to check how things were going. Ruth waved her toward the back and told her I was doing well so far. Maggie looked genuinely pleased to hear it. She asked if I wanted to walk home together. I said yes. Ruth told me she would see me in 2 days and pressed a small bag of wood, scraps, into my hand. saying I might want to try something at home if inspiration struck. Her eyes twinkled as if she already knew something I did not. Outside, the sky was turning a soft lavender as evening settled. Maggie and I walked slowly, our boots crunching through bits of snow. She asked how it went, and I told her everything. The sanding, the stories, the reclaimed wood that felt like pieces of a life waiting to be transformed. Maggie listened the whole way home, nodding occasionally, her face open and warm. When we reached her house, she nudged my shoulder lightly. "You looked peaceful when I walked in," she said. "I have not seen that expression on you before, or at least not in a long time." I did not know what to say to that. Peaceful was not a word I had ever used for myself. Maybe I'm tired, maybe quiet, maybe invisible. But peace was something else. Inside the house, she heated soup on the stove while I sorted through the scraps Ruth had given me, laying them on the table and turning them over. One piece in particular drew my attention. It had deep grooves and a knot in its center that looked like an eye. I traced the curves with my fingertip and felt something spark. Maggie glanced over from the stove. "Find something interesting?" I nodded slowly. "I think I might want to try building something. Nothing big, just something simple. Maybe a small tray or a frame. I do not know." She smiled. "Then do it. And if you need the shed, it is yours." We ate dinner quietly, both of us tired in the soft, pleasant way that comes from a day spent doing real work. Afterward, I went into the shed with the scrap pieces and set them on the workbench. The space smelled like wood and cold air, and a faint hint of Maggie's paint. From years past, I picked up one piece and held it under the small overhead light. In Charleston, I had learned to make myself smaller, to take what space was handed to me and never ask for more. Here, in this town, in this shed, in this new part-time job, I felt something shifting inside me, like the outline of my life was beginning to redraw itself. I did not know what shape it would take yet, but I knew it was mine. I stayed in the shed until my fingers grew numb. Then I finally set the wood down, shook out my hands, and stepped back inside where the warmth wrapped around me. Upstairs, in the guest room, I lay under the quilt again and stared at the familiar slanted ceiling. This time, as sleep pulled me under, I was not thinking about Charleston. I was thinking about grain patterns, reclaimed wood, and the quiet possibility of building something that did not have a head at all. And for the first time, that thought did not scare me. It felt like the beginning of something I had always wanted but never dared to imagine. It felt like the beginning of something I had always wanted but never dared to imagine. That thought followed me into sleep and, surprisingly, greeted me again when I woke up. The next few days fell into a quiet rhythm. On the mornings I worked at the shop, I would bundle up, walk past the bakery where they were just pulling bread from the oven, and step into the warmth and sawdust of Maple Hill Woodworks. Ruth would nod at me with that small half-smile of hers, and then hand me a task. Sand these edges. Sort that stack. Help glue up this frame. Simple, clear, concrete. On the days I stayed home, I found myself in Maggie's shed more and more. The little pile of scraps Ruth had sent home with me grew as I brought back. Cutoffs that were too good to throw away. Knots and curves and old nail holes. All the imperfect pieces no one would put on a showroom floor. I lined them up on the workbench and just looked at them, tracing the history buried in the grain. One evening, Ruth noticed the way I kept studying the legs of a nearly finished dining table in the shop. She called me over and tapped the end of it with her knuckles. She said that every family she built wanted a head of the table. They would point at one end and say that was where Dad would sit or Granddad. Then they would fuss about the chairs, wanting one taller or wider, with arms to mark the throne. She said she built what they asked her to, but she did not always like it. Something in my face must have shifted because she paused and asked why that look passed over me. I told her, not in a straight line, about Christmas, about my dad at the head and me in the middle, about how that one seat decided who mattered most and who was easiest to shove aside. I talked more than I expected to, the words spilling out in short bursts. When I finished, Ruth leaned against the edge of the workbench and considered me. Then she said quietly that maybe I should try drawing the table I needed, instead of the table I grew up sitting at. That sentence followed me home like a shadow. That night, after dinner, I carried a notebook and a pencil out to the shed, along with a small lamp. I spread the wood scraps across the bench, set the notebook down, and stared at the blank page. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath when I leaned close to the paper, but the act of sitting there felt right. I thought about every table I had known. The formal one in Charleston, polished so hard you could see your distorted face in it. The wobbly second-hand one I had in my old apartment, where I ate cereal for dinner more nights than I wanted to admit. The little round table in Maggie's kitchen, where the chairs all fit equally around and no one had to turn their body just to be seen. I started to sketch. The first few lines were awkward. I erased and drew again. I wanted something sturdy, not fragile. I did not want a head or a long, narrow stretch where someone could sit at one end and control everything. I drew a wide oval at first, then crossed it out. I drew a circle, then added a base that looked too bulky. I kept adjusting until finally I had something that felt right. A round top, thick enough to feel solid, and a set of legs that joined in the middle and radiated out, like they were holding each other up. As I worked, I realized something else that had always bothered me. At my family's table, the chairs were not equal. There were the grand, heavy chairs at the ends, and the lighter ones down there. At Ruth's shop, some customers wanted benches for kids and slender chairs for women, and wide ones for whoever was considered important. I tapped the pencil against the page and started drawing small rectangles around the circle. What if every seat could change height? What if a kid did not have to sit half below the surface? What if someone in a wheelchair could roll right up and be at the same level? I did not know the mechanics yet, but the idea dug its hooks into me. I stayed out there until my toes and fingers ached. At some point, Maggie opened the shed door, peeking in with a worried look. When she saw the state of the bench and my notebook filled with messy circles and little notes, she softened. She said she had brought a mug of tea and set it down by my elbow. She did not ask what I was drawing, not right away. She just said that my cheeks were pink with cold and invention, and that was a good look on me. I laughed because I did not know what else to do. Then I told her about the no-head idea. I stumbled over the words, aware of how dramatic it might sound. A table with no head, no throne, just equal seats. She listened, eyes focused, like a teacher who knew the moment a student was building something bigger than a homework assignment. She said it made sense, that a lot of the pain she saw in her classroom came from kids learning early, who was always picked first, who always got the big chair. She said she did not know anything about hardware, but she knew how humans behaved around furniture. The next day, when I walked into the shop, Ruth had my sketchbook on the workbench. I froze for a second, until I remembered that I had left it on the counter to the kitchen, and Maggie probably brought it along for me. Ruth tapped the page gently. She said that if I was serious about this, the shop had a back corner that was underused. She could clear it out so I had space to experiment. She added that she could not pay me for the design time, but she would let me use scrap wood and tools as long as I did not saw off any important fingers. I felt a rush of gratitude and terror at the same time. Serious meant this was not just a late-night doodle. Seriously, the idea had weight. We spent part of the morning refining the drawing together. Ruth suggested small changes, like adjusting the diameter so it would fit through standard doors, and thinking about how many people could sit without bumping knees. I pointed out that I wanted the legs set in from the edge so no one got stuck, straddling a post at their spot. Then we stared at the page when it came to the adjustable seats. Ruth frowned thoughtfully. She said that we could play with a simple pin and hole system on the legs of the chairs, something that could be locked into place without fancy machinery. She promised to look through her old hardware catalogs for inspiration. At lunch, as I chewed on half a sandwich, I checked my phone. There were a few messages from Mom. Nothing aggressive, just short lines asking if I had eaten, if I was sleeping, if I was okay. As I scrolled, I saw Olivia's name further down. The preview of the first text showed a string of words that made my stomach twist. I did not open it. Not yet. Instead, without fully thinking it through, I opened a new note on my phone and typed a single phrase. New table. Equal seats. I stared at the words for a long moment. They were simple, but they felt like a promise. That afternoon, in the cleared corner of the shop, I started cutting rough pieces for a small-scale prototype. Ruth stayed nearby, pretending to organize hardware bins but glancing over often. The work pulled me entirely into the present. Measuring, marking, cutting. The noise of the saw drowned out everything else. By the time my shift ended, a few of the parts were taking shape. A small circular top, not quite finished, and two short legs that hinted at the future structure. It was nothing yet, really, but it was more than a drawing. It was something I could touch. On the walk home, the cold air flushed my cheeks and cleared my head. I found myself rehearsing how I would explain this to my family if I ever chose to. They would call it dramatic. Olivia would say I was turning one bad moment into a production. My dad would scoff and ask why I could not just move on instead of building furniture to prove a point. The thought hurt and made me angry in equal measure. But then I pictured a different scene, a room full of people sitting at a table, where no one was at the head, where no one could make a toast that cut someone down without facing everyone else at the same level. That picture steadied me. That night, Maggie and I ate dinner in front of the television, while some old movie played in the background. She asked how it went, and I told her more about the prototype. She grinned and said that when I had a full-sized version, she wanted it in her classroom first. I joked that her 8-year-olds would be my test audience, and she said they were the best critics in the world because they never pretended to like something to be polite. Later, upstairs, I sat on the edge of the bed with my phone in my hand, finally opening the string of messages from Olivia. The first one accused me of ruining Christmas. The next accused me of hurting Mom. One further down said that Dad's colleagues were asking questions, and that he was sick of explaining my behavior. Then there was a line that made my chest go tight. She wrote that if I wanted a seat at the table when Dad finalized his succession plan for the family business, I had picked the worst possible time to throw a tantrum. I stared at those words until they blurred. Succession plan. A future that had never included me, until it hurt them to say it out loud. I realized, with a clarity that surprised me, that I did not want that seat anymore. Not like that. Not on those terms. I did not reply. Not to her. Instead, I opened the note with my 3 words again. New table, equal seats. I added 2 more. Mine this time. As I slid the phone onto the nightstand and turned off the lamp, the room fell into soft darkness. The wind brushed against the window. In the silence, I could almost hear the imagined sound of chairs scraping gently around a round table, voices rising in steady equality, no one towering over the rest. I lay back on the pillow and let that sound fill the space where my dad's voice used to echo. I did not know that within a few weeks, that quiet experiment in the back of a small-town workshop would collide head-on with his world, in a way neither of us saw coming. But the first threads of that collision were already in motion, winding their way from Charleston toward this snowy corner of New York, whether I was ready or not. I had no idea how quickly everything would accelerate. A few days after I read Olivia's messages, the weather turned bitter, the kind of cold that numbed your fingers through 2 layers of gloves. Maggie left early for school that morning, her breath rising in little clouds as she waved goodbye from the driveway. I walked to the shop with my hood pulled tight around my face, boots crunching through snow that had frozen stiff overnight. When I stepped inside Maple Hill Woodworks, the heat and the sawdust smell wrapped around me like a blanket. Ruth was already at her bench, tightening a clamp. She glanced up and nodded toward the back corner where my half-built prototype sat, waiting. "Good day for staying busy," she said. I nodded and pulled on my apron. We worked quietly for a while, the steady hum of tools filling the space. Around mid-morning, Ruth came over and helped me adjust the angle on the small, circular top. She explained why a slight taper might help the structure feel lighter without compromising strength. Her explanations were patient and calm. She taught without making me feel like she was correcting me. It was the kind of guidance I had never received at home. At my family's table, guidance always came wrapped in judgment and disappointment. Around noon, we took a break. I walked to the bakery to pick up sandwiches while Ruth swept the shop. When I came back, she brushed sawdust off the workbench and motioned for me to sit. We ate in companionable silence. Halfway through her sandwich, she cleared her throat. "Your mom called the shop this morning." I froze, bread halfway to my mouth. "She said she just wanted to check if you had made it in. She did not ask many questions. She sounded anxious, though." I set the sandwich down slowly. I had not told Mom where I worked. She must have asked Maggie, or maybe she searched the small-town directory. Either way, it sent a small ripple of unease through me. I asked if she said anything else. Ruth shook her head, just that she hoped you were all right. She said your dad had been asking around. A sharper unease slid down my spine. Ruth hesitated. There is more. She said your dad might come up north this weekend. Something about wanting to bring you home. The room felt suddenly warmer. Too warm for winter. My breath caught in my throat. I whispered that he could not just show up. Ruth put her sandwich down and leaned in slightly. You do not have to see anyone you do not want to see. Not here. Not in my shop. Not anywhere in this town. Her voice steadied me more than she probably knew. I nodded, absorbing the words. After lunch, I focused harder than usual, sanding long, sweeping arcs into the prototype top until the surface felt like satin under my palms. By late afternoon, the radius was perfect, and the grain lines seemed to glow. In the shop light, the small structure, still incomplete, gave me a sense of direction I had not felt since I walked out of my family's Christmas dinner. As I gathered my things to leave, Ruth called to me from across the room. You should show this to people when it is done, she said. Not just friends. Real people. Families in this town. The community center. The school. I think it will matter more than you expect. I thanked her and stepped outside into the deepening dusk. The sky was a soft blue-gray. The air sharp and metallic. Snowflakes had begun to fall again. Walking home, I kept thinking about Mom's voice on the phone with Ruth, about Dad's insistence on controlling the story, about the way he had always fixed problems by overpowering them. The idea of him tracking me down tightened something in my chest. When I reached the house, Maggie was sitting at the kitchen table grading papers. She looked up with a bright smile, but it faded when she noticed my expression. What happened? I told her everything. Mom called the shop. Dad is planning to come north. How Ruth had looked at me when she said he was trying to bring me home. Maggie's jaw tightened. She stood and filled 2 glasses with water, handing me one. Nora, you do not owe him anything. You do not owe any of them anything. You left for a reason. I nodded, but fear still curled inside me. Not fear of him exactly, but fear of the old version of myself that could crumble in front of him with a single sentence. After dinner, I went out to the shed to clear my head. The cold was deeper that night. My breath hung in the air like smoke. I flicked on the small lamp and set my notebook on the bench, flipping to the sketch for the adjustable chairs. I traced the lines with my finger. Every detail mattered. The height, the angle, the stability. This table could not resemble the one I grew up with. It had to be something new, something that broke the old rules. Something that could not be turned into a throne. I imagined a community sitting at one. Kids, teachers, older neighbors. Everyone is on the same level. No higher seat, no lower seat, just equal. And then, in the middle of the quiet shed, an idea hit me with surprising force. If I was going to build something that challenged my dad's world, I needed to protect it. Not just physically, legally. Creatively. I remembered Ruth mentioning old hardware catalogs. I remembered the note on my phone. New table, equal seats. I needed a name, something that meant more than furniture. I flipped to a blank page and wrote the first thing that came to mind. Common circle. The words sat there, simple and clean. They felt right. Considered, grounded, not fancy or sleek, just human. A small knock startled me. Maggie pushed open the shed door, pulling her sweater close around her shoulders. It is freezing out here, she said. You okay? I nodded and held up the notebook. She stepped closer and studied the sketch, her breath making soft clouds. Nora, this is beautiful. The way she said it made something inside me loosen, like she meant it beyond the drawing. For a moment, we just stood there in the cold shed, the soft light falling across the pages. Then Maggie gently touched the corner of the sketch. What are you going to do with this? I swallowed, feeling the weight of the decision in my chest. I think I am going to build it. She smiled, small and steady. Then I think this is the start of your real life. Her words hit me harder than she probably intended. We walked back to the house together, snow collecting on our sleeves. The sky had turned a deep violet. Through the kitchen windows, the house glowed warm and golden. Inside, Maggie made tea while I sat at the table, my mind still buzzing with ideas. My phone buzzed on the counter, but I ignored it. I did not want to know who it was tonight. When I finally checked it before bed, there were 10 new messages. 2 from Mom, 1 from my aunt, 7 from Olivia. The last one made my stomach drop. Dad booked a flight. He arrives Saturday. I stared at the words until the screen dimmed. Saturday was 2 days away. I set the phone down slowly, my heart beat loud enough to feel in my fingertips. Upstairs, in the guest room, I crawled under the quilt and stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind scrape against the window. 2 days. 2 days until the past walked straight into the life I had barely begun. Building. I closed my eyes, but the darkness did not soften the fear or the resolve growing beneath it. One way or another, something was going to break wide open, and this time, I was not running. One way or another, something was going to break wide open, and this time, I was not running. Saturday came faster than I wanted it to. I woke before dawn, heart already thudding like it knew what was coming. The sky outside the window was still black, the streetlights throwing dull yellow circles on snowbanks that had frozen, solid overnight. Downstairs, Maggie was already in the kitchen in an old sweatshirt and leggings, hair in a messy knot, staring into her mug like it might tell her the future. She looked up when I came in, and I could see the question in her eyes before she even spoke. She asked if I had heard anything else. I checked my phone as the coffee dripped. No new messages from Olivia, none from Mom, just the last one that said Dad had a flight. I said that he was still coming. At least that was what they said. Maggie took a long breath, then told me that whatever happened today, I would not be facing him alone. We had already made plans for that afternoon. Ruth had loved the idea of a first showing of the table and had suggested an open studio evening. Nothing huge, just some locals, a few teachers, a couple of families, some of her regular customers. She joked that people loved any excuse to drink hot cider and see what was new. For me, it was more than that. It was the first time anyone other than Ruth and Maggie would see the prototype that had lived in my notebook and my head for weeks. Common circle, no head, equal seats. After breakfast, we drove to the shop together because Maggie did not like the idea of me walking alone with my nerves wound tight. The sky had turned a pale gray by then, heavy with more snow. When we pulled up in front of Maple Hill Woodworks, I could see the warm light already spilling through the front windows. Inside, Ruth had cleared the center of the room. The usual pieces had been pushed back against the walls. The floor was swept clean. Right in the middle sat my table. Seeing it there took my breath for a second. The round top gleamed softly, the natural grain forming quiet rings that seemed to draw the eye inward. The legs meet at the center and spread out in 4 sturdy curves, leaving the edge open for knees and feet. Around it sat 8 chairs on simple, adjustable legs that clicked into place, at different heights. Ruth had even put small colored pads on the seats, just to give it a touch of warmth. She came over, wiping her hands on her apron. She said that it looked ready. Then she asked how I was holding up. I told her the truth, that I was more afraid of seeing my dad walk in than I had been of walking out. On Christmas, that there was a part of me that still felt 12 years old whenever I pictured his face. Her expression softened. She told me again that this was my space, my project, my life. She said that he did not get to stomp into this town and make the rules. We spent the morning finishing the small details. Maggie helped string soft white lights around the front windows. Ruth simmered apple cider with cinnamon on a hot plate in the back, filling the whole shop with a smell so comforting it almost made my eyes sting. I adjusted each chair, testing the pins and making sure they settled evenly. Right before lunch, my phone buzzed. My heart jumped, but it was not Dad. It was Mom. A short message. She wrote that she had heard he was flying up and that she hoped I was safe. She said she wished she could be there, but that things were complicated at home. She asked me to let her know I was all right when I could. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I typed that I was okay and that I was working on something important. I did not say what. Not yet. For a while, the day felt almost normal. Locals dropped by to say they would come back for the open evening. The woman from the bakery promised to bring a plate of cookies. One of Maggie's fellow teachers said she was curious to see what kind of table. Had her colleague talking about rearranging her whole classroom. By 3 p.m, the clouds outside had thickened, and snowflakes began to drift lazily past the staff window. Ruth locked the door for a bit so we could eat and catch our breath. We sat at a small work table at the back. Sandwiches again, hands moving more than our mouths. My stomach fluttered too much for real hunger. Around 4, my phone rang. Not a message, a call. The name on the screen made my pulse spike. Dad. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Then I thought about how many times I had ducked his calls or molded my tone to keep him calm. The room around me blurred a little. I stood and walked toward the back storage area for some privacy, the phone heavy in my hand. I answered. I said his name just once. His voice came through steady and firm, the exact tone he used at board meetings and holiday dinners. He said he had landed in Albany and was driving toward town. He said the roads were slow, but he would be there soon. Then his words shifted. He said we needed to talk like adults and put this nonsense behind us. He told me he had been more than patient and that it was time for me to come home and stop hiding. The old reflex kicked in, that urge to explain, to soften, to keep him from getting angrier. I felt it rise up and I pushed it down. I told him calmly that I was not coming home, that I was working here now, that my life was here, at least for the time being. I told him that if he was coming to see me, he would be walking into my world for once, not the other way around. There was a pause on his end, the faint sound of tires on wet pavement in the background. Then his voice cooled. He said that if I wanted to play at independence for a bit like some wayward teenager, he would indulge that. But I needed to remember who paid my phone bill, who had kept a roof over my head, who had given me every opportunity. Then he said he would see me in a couple of hours and hung up without waiting for a reply. I stood there staring at the silent phone. Ruth appeared in the doorway a moment later, reading my face with one practiced glance. She did not ask what he said. She just asked what I needed. I said that I needed this evening to happen exactly how we had planned. I needed him to see the table surrounded by people who were not afraid of him. I needed to see myself in that picture too. As the time for the open studio drew closer, more people arrived. Maggie's car pulled up first. Then the bakery owner and her teenage son carried trays. 2 older men from down the street. A young couple with a toddler. The small-town librarian. They stamped snow from their boots and shrugged off coats, the shop filling with chatter and warmth. Ruth unlocked the door and turned the front sign to open. She said we would keep it casual, let people wander in and out. But word had clearly spread. Within 30 minutes, there were a dozen bodies in the space, circling the table, touching the smooth surface, testing the seats. Maggie slipped into teacher mode and started explaining to anyone who asked how each chair could adjust so no one had to crane their neck. Ruth talked about reclaimed wood and why she liked the base so much. I stood off to the side at first, watching, listening. A few people asked me directly what had inspired it. I told them bits of the truth, that I had grown up at a very formal table where the same person always sat at, the head. I wanted to see what would happen if there was no head and no foot, if every seat meant the same thing. An older woman with white hair pulled back in a clip listened closely. She said that she had spent 30 years serving big holiday meals where her husband carved at the end and she hovered near the kitchen. She told me she wished she had had a table like this when her kids were small. Her hand brushed the edge gently, like she was touching a memory. Her words made my throat tighten. Just before 6, a hush rolled through the room that I did not understand at first. People shifted, turning toward the front windows. I followed their gaze. Outside, headlights cut through the falling snow. A dark sedan pulled up and idled at the curb. I knew that car. I knew the silhouette that appeared behind the windshield even before the door opened. Dad stepped out into the gray light of early evening in a dark wool coat that probably cost more than everything in the shop combined. He paused, taking in the shop front, the hand-painted sign, the people visible through the glass. Then he straightened his shoulders and walked in. The bell over the door chimed softly. Conversation dropped almost to nothing. He glanced around, eyes landing on the table in the center, then on me. For a second, something like surprise flashed across his face, and then it was gone, replaced by the familiar, careful control. He walked toward me as if we were the only two people in the room. He said my name, low and smooth, and told me I had certainly found a way to make a statement. He let his gaze sweep the circle of chairs. He said that this must be my new project, my little rebellion. His tone barely disguised the disdain. I felt Maggie move a step closer on one side, and Ruth on the other, a quiet flanking I could sense more than see. I looked him straight in the eye and told him that this was not a rebellion. It was a design. This was how I wanted people to sit together. He lifted a brow, as if amused, and asked loudly if anyone here really believed a table could change how a family behaved. The question hung in the air. A couple of people shifted uncomfortably. The older woman with white hair narrowed her eyes. Ruth stepped forward then, and addressed him without raising her voice. She said that maybe it could, that sometimes changing the furniture changed who felt welcome in the room. Maggie added that her students behaved differently depending on how she set up the desks. When everyone could see each other, more of them spoke. My dad listened with a faint half-smile, like he was humoring children. Then he did what I had known in my bones that he would do. He walked to the table, reached out, and took an empty chair at one point on the circle. He dragged it back a few inches, just enough to make it feel separate, a little more important. Then he sat down there and leaned back, commanding all the sightlines. He announced in his practiced dinner voice that since this was clearly some kind of celebration, someone ought to say a few words. The old script was unfolding right there in the middle of my new design. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs. The room waited, everyone watching me, watching him, watching the table that was supposed to have no head. Every part of my old self wanted to freeze or shrink or laugh it off. Instead, I took one breath, then another, stepped forward until my hand rested on the smooth edge of the wood, and opened my mouth. The words that came next would decide whether this table stayed true to what I had built or turned into another stage for him. And with everyone watching, including the man who had once raised a glass and called me wasted space, I finally chose which story was going to win. The words that came next would decide whether this table stayed true to what I had built or turned into another stage for him. I laid my palm flat on the wood and let my voice come out steady. At this table, we sit in a circle and we listen, I said. No one stands at the head. No one gets to use a toast to put someone else beneath them. If you want to speak, you speak as part of the circle, not above it. The room stayed very quiet. I could feel Maggie behind my left shoulder, Ruth just to my right. My dad sat in that pulled-back chair, eyebrows lifted, like he was humoring a nervous child. He gave a little laugh and said that it was an interesting concept, but someone had to lead. That was how you avoided chaos. Obviously had to be in charge. The older woman with white hair spoke up before I could. She said she had lived with a man who believed that for 40 years, and all it got her was a bad back and a lot of cold dinners waiting on him. People chuckled softly. My dad turned toward her, surprised, not used to being challenged by strangers. A young mom near the window shifted her baby on her hip and said that when she sat on the floor with her kids, and they all shared the crayons. They listened to each other better than her extended family ever had around a time. Formal table. Ruth stepped closer to my dad, not backing down. She told him calmly that, in her experience, when people sat like this, no one could hide at the far end. Everyone had to look each other in the eye. She said maybe leadership was not about having a bigger chair, but about being willing to be eye level with everyone else. My dad's smile tightened. He glanced around, clearly annoyed that the room was not falling into silent agreement like ours relatives always had. He said to me that this was exactly what he meant, that I had run away to a place where people encouraged my worst impulses. Instead of coming home and talking to my family, I was putting on a little show for strangers and making him out to be some villain. There it was, the script I knew by heart. He was the reasonable one. I was the dramatic daughter airing private business in public. The difference this time was that the people in the room had not grown up under his thumb. They only knew what they were seeing. A man trying to pull a chair out of a circle to make himself taller. I took a breath and felt the weight of every Christmas, every birthday, Every time he had looked right past me at the boy or the person he thought mattered more. "You called me wasted space in front of our entire family," I said. Not shouting, just stating it like a fact. "You raised a glass over dessert and said some kids build things and some kids just take up space. And then you laughed, and they laughed with you." A little murmur moved through the room. Mitzing's hand brushed lightly against my elbow, grounding me. My dad opened his mouth, already shaking his head. He said that it had been a joke, a figure of speech, that I was misremembering, that I always had been sensitive. I felt something inside me go very still. I was not back at that table. I was right here. My hand on wood I had chosen. People around me who had seen my work with their own eyes. I said that I had recorded it on my phone, that I had listened to it in that shed behind Maggie's house while my fingers were too cold to bend. I said I had listened to it so many times that every chuckle was burned into my memory. "Hi, Olivia's, our aunts and uncles. The cousins copied them." His face changed. Just a flicker, but I saw it. That quick flash of calculation, the realization that he could not simply rewrite this one. Then I did something that surprised even me. I reached over to the chair he had pulled back and nudged it gently with my foot, sliding it back into the circle until it matched the curve of the others. "If you want to sit here," I said, "you are welcome. But this chair does not sit behind the others. It does not sit above them. You sit with us, or you do not sit at all." The older woman nodded approvingly. Someone near the back let out a breath that sounded almost like a yes. My dad looked down at the chair, then at the people watching. For a long second, I thought he might actually pick it up and leave. Instead, he pushed it forward an inch himself and sat back down, this time level with the people beside him. He said quietly that I was making a scene. I said just as quietly that I was finally telling the truth in the same room, where he could hear it. For a few heavy moments, we just looked at each other. His jaw worked like he was chewing words. Mine stayed still. Ruth broke the tension by asking our guests to try something. She said that since there was no head, maybe everyone could take a turn, sharing one moment when they had felt pushed to the side in their own family and what they wished had been different. People shifted, a little hesitant. Then the white-haired woman spoke again. She said she had always been the one washing dishes while the men fell asleep in front of football. She said she wished just once someone had handed her a plate of food while she sat down first. A man in his 60s admitted that his brothers had always talked over him, and he had learned to swallow his anger rather than rock the boat. A teenager talked about being the quiet middle child and how it felt to finally be seen in Maggie's classroom when she moved his seat. As they talked, the circle felt less like a showcase and more like what I had dreamed of, a structure that nudged people to see each other. No one voice towering over the rest. My dad sat there, listening, his expression hard to read. Every now and then, his eyes flicked to me, then away. Eventually, the librarian gently asked if I would tell them what I hoped this table would do. I said that I had lived my whole life at a table where I knew exactly which chair meant power and which chair meant silence. That when my dad called me wasted space, something snapped inside me. I said I drove through the night until the sun came up over a town that did not know my last name. That I found a friend and a job and a workshop, and I started designing the kind of table I wished I had grown up sitting at. I did not say I built it to spite him. I built it to save myself. When I finished, the room was quiet again, but it did not feel like the old heavy silence around our family dinners. This one felt full, like people were holding the same thought at once. Then, unexpectedly, my dad spoke with a voice I had rarely heard outside of private moments with. My mom, after he had a hard week at work. He said that maybe he should sit and listen, rather than give a toast for once. He said that maybe he had gotten too used to standing at the head of things, and that it was possible, just possible, that he had not noticed who got squeezed out down the sides. It was not an apology, not the way I had once fantasized about in middle school, but it was a crack, a hairline fracture in the stone. I let it be what it was. I did not rush in to make him feel better. I did not say it was all right. It was not. Instead, I turned to the people around the circle and asked them if anyone else wanted to share how it felt to sit where they could see everyone. Conversation picked up again, this time warmer. Someone laughed. Someone used the word future. People shifted their chairs closer, testing the pins, adjusting the height so everyone's eyes met in a more natural way. My dad stayed seated for a few more minutes, then stood up abruptly. He thanked Ruth for hosting, said it was an impressive piece of craftsmanship, looked at me, and said that his hotel reservation had a check-in time and the roads were getting worse. I did not follow him to the door. Maggie and I watched from the center of the room as he pulled on his gloves and stepped out into the falling snow. The sedan's headlights washed briefly across the windows, then disappeared down the street. People lingered long after he left. They circled the table, tried the chairs, and drank the last of the cider. Before she went home, the white-haired woman put a hand over mine and said that some of us take a little longer to build a life we should have been given from the start. Then she said that my table would help a lot of people do it faster. When the last guest stepped out into the cold and Ruth locked the door behind them, the shop fell into a deep calm. The three of us stood around the table, the hum of the heater and the faint creak of old wood settling the only sounds. Ruth said that she had already had 3 people ask if I was taking orders. A community center director, the librarian, a couple who ran a small counseling practice. She said it in her usual even tone, but her eyes glinted with something like pride. Maggie squeezed my shoulder and said that whatever happened with my family, I had just witnessed something real. People choose a different way to sit together. I nodded, but I felt hollow and full at the same time, exhausted. We cleaned up in silence, stacking mugs and folding napkins. When I finally pulled on my coat, my phone buzzed in the pocket, insistent. I fished it out and glanced at the screen. For a second, my brain did not register the number. 35 missed calls. The list scrolled down as I stared. 10 from Dad. 10 from Olivia. 5 from Mom. The rest from aunts and one unknown number I could guess belonged to one of his business partners. A couple of voicemails sat at the bottom of the list like small, dark stones. Hours had passed while we were inside, while I was touching the wood and speaking my truth, and watching strangers claim their own. I opened one voicemail. From Mom. Her voice shook. She said that my dad had come back to the hotel in a mood she had never heard before. She said he had tried to call me from the car, and that when I did not answer, he had called everyone else. He was talking about how I had embarrassed him, how people at the club would hear, how I did not understand what I was doing. Then her voice changed, just a little. She said that she had watched the video someone had posted online, a short clip of me standing at the table, hand on the wood, saying that this was how I wanted people to sit together, where no one could be laughed out of the room. She whispered that I looked strong, that for the first time she could remember, his voice did not drown out mine. I had not even known anyone was recording. In a small town, of course they were. I listened to part of a voicemail from Olivia, too. She sounded furious, saying that Dad was a wreck and that I needed to call him and fix it, that I should have just come home and talked to them privately, that I did not understand the damage I was doing. I deleted that one halfway through, not out of anger, but because I did not need those words settling into my bones again. Standing there in the quiet shop, with snow ticking softly against the windows, I realized something that felt almost like relief. For years, my worst fear had been exactly this, that I would say what I really felt and be met with rage, lectures, endless calls and messages, that the world would tilt on its axis and swallow me whole. Now it has happened. The calls had come. The voicemails had spilled out. The anger had arrived right on schedule. And I was still standing. I put the phone on Ruth's workbench and looked at the table one last time before we turned off the lights. Common circle. No head. Equal seats. Designed by the girl who had once been told she took up too much space at her own family dinner. On the drive home with Maggie, the streets quiet and blanketed in fresh snow, she asked softly what I was going to do about the calls. I said I would text Mom in the morning and tell her I was safe and that I loved her. I said I might send Dad one message, nothing long, just a clean line that said I would not tolerate being spoken to that way again. That my life was here now, and if he wanted to be part of it, he would have to sit in the circle like everyone else. Maggie nodded approvingly. She said that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was answer once, and then let the silence do the rest. Later that night, back in the guest room at her house, I lay awake for a long time, listening to the old radiator hiss and the wind move around the corners of the building. My phone sat on the nightstand, dark, face down. I thought about revenge. The way people talk about it online, like a neat story beat, something dramatic and satisfying. A ruined reputation, a cut-off inheritance, a door slammed in someone's face. What I had done did not feel neat. It felt messy and painful and necessary. I had not destroyed my dad's world. I had just stopped letting it be the only one that defined me. My revenge, if you could call it that, was not watching him crumble. It was watching myself stand upright in a room full of people and refuse to shrink when he pulled a chair out of a circle. It was building a table where, someday, if he ever chose to sit down with open hands instead of pointed fingers, there might actually be a seat for him. It was knowing that whether or not he ever took that seat, I was going to keep building more of them for people who had never had one. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember that silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from. And as you sit wherever you are right now, I hope you feel like there is finally a table where you belong.